The late September sun cast long shadows through the trees as Mike shouldered his pack higher, checking his GPS one last time before the battery died. The device showed him about 16 miles into the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area, well off the main Appalachian Trail. He'd wanted solitude, and he'd found it. Maybe a little too much of it. But the irony wasn't lost on him that he'd come here to clear his head after Sarah left, and now all he could think about was her last words to him. "You spend more time in those damn mountains than you do with me." Who knows, maybe she was right. Maybe his obsession with solo hiking had pushed her away, but out here amongst the ancient trees and worn mountains, he felt more himself than he ever did in the city. The mountains didn't demand anything from him except respect and caution. They didn't care that at 32 years old, he was still trying to figure out what he wanted from life, or that his job as a software developer left him feeling hollow inside. The wind whispered through the yellowing leaves overhead, carrying the first hints of autumn's chill. Mike had been hiking since dawn, and his legs burned with the effort of climbing the endless ridges and valleys that characterized this section of the Appalachians. The mountains here were old, worn down by millions of years of rain and wind, but they could still break a man who didn't respect them. He'd seen it happen before, overconfident hikers who thought their expensive gear and GPS devices made them invincible. His father had taught him better than that, though. You see, John Marshall had been an old-school outdoorsman, the kind who could navigate by stars and find water in the driest conditions. "The mountains don't care about your fancy equipment," he used to say. "They only care if you're smart enough to listen to them." Dad had died 3 years ago, but Mike still heard his voice sometimes. Especially out here in the wilderness they both loved. He needed to make camp soon. The shadows were growing longer by the minute, and although he'd originally planned to push on to the next ridge, something in his gut told him to stop here. The clearing he'd found was good enough, relatively flat, with a small stream burbling nearby, and enough dead wood scattered about to keep a fire going through the night. His father would have approved of the spot, sheltered on 3 sides by rising ground, with good drainage and multiple escape routes if needed. Mike dropped his pack and rolled his shoulders, working out the kinks from carrying 40 pounds of gear all day. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across, ringed by ancient oaks and maples whose branches reached toward each other overhead like gnarled fingers. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that crackled under his boots as he walked the perimeter, checking for any obvious hazards. Widowmakers hanging overhead, poison ivy clustering at the bases of trees, or signs of recent animal activity. The trees here were old, really old. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, bark deeply furrowed with age. Mike ran his hand along one of the massive oaks, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. These trees had been here long before European settlers arrived, maybe even before the Cherokee, who once called these mountains home. They'd seen centuries of seasons, countless storms, and who knew what else in their long lives. Finding nothing concerning, he set about making camp with the efficiency of someone who'd done this dozens of times before. The tent went up first, a lightweight 2-person model that he used for solo trips, giving him extra room for gear. Sarah had always teased him about being over-prepared, but he'd rather carry a few extra pounds than find himself lacking something essential miles from civilization. He just finished staking down the last corner when the first odd sensation crept over him. A feeling of being watched. It wasn't the usual sensation of wildlife observing an intruder in their territory. This felt different, more focused, more intelligent. Mike straightened up, scanning the trees. The forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering, just the soft whisper of wind through leaves and the distant sound of running water. He'd spent enough time in the backcountry to know that sudden silence usually meant something was out there. Probably a deer or maybe even a black bear, but the silence felt wrong somehow, more complete than it should be, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" He called out, more to break the silence than anything else. His voice sounded smaller than he'd intended, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before disappearing into the gathering shadows. No response, of course. Just that eerie silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical object. Shaking off the unease, Michael focused on gathering wood. The sun was sinking faster now, the golden late afternoon light taking on an orange tinge. He worked quickly, gathering an impressive pile of dry wood, enough to last well into the night. He'd always found comfort in a good campfire, not just for the warmth and for the light, but for that primal sense of security that it provided. Humans had gathered around fires for hundreds of thousands of years, finding safety in its glow. As he worked on building the fire, that feeling of being watched intensified. Twice he caught himself spinning around, sure that he'd seen movement in his peripheral vision, only to find nothing there. The shadows between the trees seemed to glow darker, more substantial, even though the sun hadn't quite set yet. They seemed to pulse slightly, like something breathing in the darkness. The fire caught quickly thanks to the dry tinder in his experience. Mike sat back on his heels, watching the flames grow, trying to ignore the growing knot of unease in his stomach. He'd been solo camping for years, all over the country, and he'd never felt quite like this before. Something felt wrong. It reminded him of the time he'd gone hiking in Glacier National Park and had the distinct of being stalked by a mountain lion. That same prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, that same certainty that something was watching him with hungry eyes. He forced himself to go through the motions of setting up the camp and trying to maintain normalcy. He hung his food bag on the branch well away from his tent, gathered water from the stream to filter, and to prepare for his dinner. A simple meal of dehydrated chicken and rice that he barely tasted. The entire time, that feeling of being observed never left him. If anything, it grew stronger as the day faded away. The sun set with surprising speed, as it often did in the mountains. One moment there was still light filtering through the trees, and the next, darkness had settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. Mike built up the fire and sat close to it, his back to the flames so his eyes could adjust to the darkness. The night was moonless, and beyond the firelight, the fire was an impenetrable wall of black. He tried to distract himself by reading on his Kindle, but the words wouldn't stick in his mind. His thoughts kept drifting to the darkness beyond the fire's reach, to what might be lurking there. The rational part of his brain told him he was being ridiculous. He was an experienced outdoorsman, not some rookie camper jumping at shadows. But another part of him, something much more older and more primitive, was screaming at him to run. And that's when he heard it. A sound like nails on wood coming from somewhere in the darkness. It was brief, just a quick scraping noise, but it made the hair on his back of the neck stand up. It didn't sound like any animal he knew, and he knew most of the creatures that called these mountains home. Not a bear's claw, not a raccoon scrambling, not even the sound of a deer's hooves scraping bark. No, this was different, deliberate somehow, almost like someone dragging their fingernails down a tree trunk. "All right, who's there?" He called out again, his voice stronger this time, anger mixing in with his fear. If this was some local trying to scare him, they were doing a damn good job of it. He'd heard stories of trail magic gone wrong, of people trying to frighten hikers for their own amusement. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, followed by something that might have been breathing. A wet, raspy sound that reminded him of his grandfather in his final days, when fluid had begun filling his lungs. The sound brought back vivid memories of sitting in that sterile hospital room, watching helplessly as the strongest man he'd known slowly drowned in his own body. Mike grabbed his flashlight, a powerful LED model that could illuminate targets hundreds of feet away. He swept the beam in a wide arc around his camp, the light catching on tree trunks and undergrowth, creating deep shadows that seemed to move and shift in the darkness beyond. The beam revealed nothing unusual at first, just trees and undergrowth, normal forest scenes that somehow looked sinister in the harsh artificial light. But then, for a split second, he thought he saw something. A pale form ducking behind a tree. It moved too quickly for him to get a good look, but what he did see made his blood run cold. The shape had been wrong somehow. Too tall and too thin to be a human, but moving with an awful kind of purpose. Its movements had been smooth but unnatural, like watching a spider crawl in stop motion. "If anybody's out here, I do have a weapon," he lied, his voice shaking slightly. His only real weapon was a small folding knife, meant more for cutting rope and apples and preparing food than self-defense. He'd never felt the need to carry anything more serious. Bears could be scared off with noise and spray, and he'd never worried much about human threats this far from civilization. The response was another scraping sound, this time from behind him. Mike whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing beyond the fire's glow. The sounds were coming from different directions now, as if whatever was out there was circling his camp, testing his defenses, looking for weakness. He retreated to his tent, zipping himself inside even though he knew the thin nylon walls offered no real protection. He left the flashlight on, pointing it at the tent ceiling to create a dome of light around him. His hand shook as he pulled out his phone. No signal, of course. He was miles from the nearest cell tower, and the screen's glow seemed weak and insufficient against the pressing darkness outside. The night seemed to press in around him, the darkness beyond his tent absolute, except for the flickering firelight that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Mike sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, straining his ears for any sound of movement outside. His mind raced through the possibilities. A bear, mountain lion, human stalker perhaps, but none of them felt right. Whatever was out there moved wrong, and it sounded wrong. For a long time, Michael sat there. There was nothing. The fire cracked, and somewhere off in the distance, an owl called, a normal sound that provided little comfort, and Mike began to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and darkness had played tricks on his mind. Maybe Sarah had been right about him spending too much time alone. Maybe the solitude was finally getting to him. But then something brushed against the side of his tent. The touch was light at first, almost tentative, like someone running their fingers along the fabric. Mike held his breath, watching as something pressed against the fabric, creating a shallow indentation. Then came the scratch, long and slow, starting near the top of the tent and dragging downwards. The sound was like sandpaper on silk, a dry, rasping noise that made his teeth ache. "Go away now," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The words seemed to hang in the air, mocking him with their ineffectiveness. The scratching stopped, but the presence remained. Mike could sense it just inches away, separated from him by only a thin layer of nylon. His flashlight beam caught on the tent wall, and he saw something that made his heart stop. The shadow of long, thin fingers, too long to be human, moving slowly across the fabric. They seemed to be feeling their way along the surface, exploring and searching. He scrambled backwards, pressing against the far side of the tent. The fingers continued their slow movement, tracing patterns on the wall. Then came another set of fingers on the other side of the tent, and another, until it seemed like the entire structure was surrounded. The movements were coordinated somehow, as if all the hands were connected to a single consciousness that was testing the boundaries of his shelter. The breathing sound returned, louder now, right outside of his tent. It was followed by something new, a low, wet clicking noise that reminded Mike of someone rapidly clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth, but distorted somehow. The sound made him think of insects, of something inhuman trying to communicate in ways that human vocal cords were never meant to produce. Mike's flashlight beam caught something through the tent fabric, a silhouette of what was outside. And the figure was tall, impossibly tall. Its proportions were all wrong. The head was too large and oddly shaped, and the arms seemed to hang down, almost to the ground. And as he watched, frozen in horror, the figure slowly tilted his head, the movement jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being manipulated by an unskilled puppeteer. The clicking sound grew louder, more intense, and was joined by that awful scraping sound as multiple sets of long fingers dragged across the tent walls. Mike could see them pressing against the fabric, leaving long trails in the condensation that had formed on the inside of the tent. The fingers moved with terrible purpose now, no longer exploring, but searching for weaknesses, testing the strength of the material. And he did the only thing he could think of. He screamed. The sound tore from his throat, raw and primal, echoing through the clearing. It was the kind of scream he didn't know he was capable of making. The sound of pure animal terror that bypassed all rational thought, and the creature outside responded with a sound of its own. A high, keening wail that started low and rose in pitch until it was almost beyond human hearing, like a dentist drill boring into a skull. The fingers withdrew, and for a moment, there was absolute silence. Mike sat there, shaking. His throat was raw from screaming, waiting for what would come next. The silence stretched out, broken only by his ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. And the attack, when it finally came, was explosive. Something slammed into the side of the tent with a tremendous force, nearly collapsing it. Mike threw himself toward the door, his trembling fingers fighting with the zipper, and behind him he could hear the fabric tearing as something ripped through it with the sound of shredding silk. The cold night air rushed in through the gaps, carrying with it a smell like wet earth and decay. Mike burst out of the tent and ran towards the fire, which had burned down to glowing coals. In the dim light, he caught his first clear glimpse of what had been stalking him, and his mind recoiled from what it was seeing, trying to make sense of something that shouldn't exist. It was pale, its skin having a sickly grayish-white color that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, its body emaciated but powerful looking, with long arms that ended in hands bearing fingers like pale spiders, and its face was almost human, but stretched and distorted, with 2 large black eyes and a mouth full of needle-like teeth. The skin was pulled tight over its skull, giving it the appearance of a corpse that somehow remained animate. The thing moved with an unnatural grace, its body flowing like water as it circled the dying fire. Each movement was smooth but wrong, as if its joints bent in ways that evolution had never intended. It kept its black eyes fixed on Mike, and in their depths he saw something that broke him. An intelligence, ancient and alien and hungry. Mike backed away, fumbling with his flashlight. The beam caught the creature full in the face, and it recoiled with that same keening cry he had heard before, raising one long-fingered hand to shield its eyes. The light seemed to hurt it, making its pale skin smoke slightly where the beam touched it. Light. It didn't like the light. Mike ran for the woodpile, grabbed several branches, and thrust them into the coals. The dry wood caught quickly, sending up a shower of sparks. The creature retreated from the renewed flames, its movements becoming more agitated, more predatory. It circled just beyond the firelight, its form seeming to shift and flow in the darkness, sometimes appearing more human, sometimes more bestial. For hours that felt like years, Mike kept the fire burning bright, feeding it every piece of wood he could reach. The creature never left, but it stayed just beyond the firelight, watching Michael with those terrible black eyes. Sometimes he could see it moving through the trees, its pale form flitting from shadow to shadow, and other times he had only heard it, that wet breathing, the clicking sounds, the occasional scrape of its claws against tree bark. Mike lost track of time, focused only on keeping the fire alive. His world narrowed to the circle of firelight in the darkness beyond, where something impossible waited for the flames to die off. Every time the fire began to dim, the creature would move closer, testing the boundaries of light and shadow. Sometimes it would reach one long arm into the firelight, its fingers grasping at the air before the heat forced it to withdraw. The first hint of dawn found Mike still feeding the fire, his hands shaking with exhaustion and fear, and as the sky began to lighten, the creature's movements became more frantic, more desperate. Mike caught glimpses of it retreating further into the woods, its pale form seeming to fade like mist in the growing light. The clicking sounds became more rapid, almost angry, and the scratching on the trees intensified. When the sun finally crested the eastern ridge, sending golden rays through the trees, Mike was alone. The creature was gone, leaving behind only deep scratches in his tent fabric and in the bark of several trees around his camp. The gouges in the trees were deep and deliberate, forming patterns that looked almost like writing in some ancient, forgotten language. He broke camp in record time, his hand shaking so badly he could barely roll up his sleeping bag. The morning was beautiful, full of bird song and dappled sunlight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him from the deep shadows under the forest trees. Every time the wind moved the branches, he jumped, expecting to see that pale form flowing through the forest. Mike practically ran the 16 miles back to his car, stopping only twice to gulp water and to check his map. He passed other hikers on the main trail, nodding to them with wild eyes, wanting to warn them but knowing they'd never believe him. How could he explain what he'd seen? Who would believe that something ancient and hungry still lurked in these old mountains? Something that had been here long before humans first walked on these ridges. That night, safe in his own bed, he'd researched what he'd seen. The descriptions matched something called the Rake, a creature of modern folklore that stalked people in wooded areas. The stories claimed it was some kind of experiment gone wrong, or an ancient creature that had always lived in the dark places of the world. But Mike didn't know what to believe anymore. He knew what he'd seen, what had hunted him through that long, dark night. And Mike never went camping alone again. Sometimes he thought about calling Sarah, telling her she'd been right about the dangers of solo hiking, but he knew she wouldn't understand. How could she? He barely understood it himself. The scratches on his tent, which he'd kept as proof, slowly faded over time, but other things remained. His fear of the dark, his inability to sleep without a light on, the way he flinched at the sound of scratching. And sometimes on dark nights, when the wind blows just right, he swears that he could hear wet breathing and the clicking of something moving in the darkness outside of his window. He keeps his blinds closed now and always sleeps with a light on, because he knows that somewhere in the ancient Appalachian mountains, something pale and hungry is waiting in the shadows, watching with black eyes for the next person who wanders too far from the trail. He knows it's still out there, scratching its ancient messages into tree bark, leaving its marks for those who know where to look. And sometimes, when he's laying awake at night, he swears he can hear scratching at his walls, and a soft, wet clicking sound that seems to say, "I remember you."